Not too long ago, it was commonplace for blockbuster films to have their own video game tie-ins, usually only for the sake of cashing in on a film's buzz and brand recognition. These games tended to be made fast and cheap so as to meet the related film's release window, and so developed a harsh reputation as being derivative, rushed messes with little creative vision. Nowadays, it simply doesn't pay to invest in developing full-scale games unless you know for a fact that you're going to sell a hell of a lot of copies, which in the current games market is rarely a guarantee, so movies will opt for something easier, like a knockoff mobile game or a Fortnite crossover. As such, the age of the movie tie-in game is pretty much over, and while that's probably for the best, it's worth remembering that diamonds occasionally appeared in the rough. These games were never masterpieces, but were remarkable for showing an unexpected ambition in adapting their films into the video game format. Probably the best known example of this would be the Spider-Man 2 game tied to the 2004 film, which, with its playground of an open world and deeply satisfying swinging mechanics, set a standard for superhero games that has proven surprisingly hard to top. There have been many subsequent Spider-Man games that have tried to meet its quality by following closely in its footsteps. Even Insomniac's more recent take on the wall crawler, released almost 15 years after Spider-Man 2, owes much of its mechanical identity to that game. Though the particular diamond we'll be discussing today doesn't have such a clear-cut lineage trailing off from it, it contains within it many of the elements of structure, pacing, and presentation that would go on to define the next decade or so of single-player action games. That game is Peter Jackson's King Kong, the official game of the movie. I'm far from the first person to make such a statement about this game. On this very platform, you'll find many a video essay exalting Kong as a forgotten gem. Even Polygon ran an article a few years back wherein the writer called Kong, quote, the most innovative game of its console generation. Nearly anywhere on the internet you see King Kong being discussed, if you scroll the comments section long enough, you're likely to see someone shouting out the game as a high point in the Kong brand that is all too easily forgotten about. My point is that it's no secret that this game stuck with people in a more significant way than most movie tie-ins. I myself have very fond memories of the game from when it fell into my lap one Christmas morning, and I subsequently replayed it again and again for years. For the uninitiated, the game is probably best described as a first-person action adventure with a tinge of survival horror, depending on how scared you are of dinosaurs and millipedes. There are also sections where you play as the titular king himself, but most of the game sets you directly in the role of the film's protagonist Jack Driscoll, loosely following the film's progression as you traverse Skull Island, a jungle-ridden hellscape where primal Earth still reigns. You fend off voracious predators as you scrape through shoulder-deep swamps, dripping caves, and ancient grown-over ruins packed with the bones of prey that have long since succumbed to Predator. Your character is vulnerable, your options for defending yourself are limited, and everything you can see wants to kill you, leading to frantic battles where the only difference between you and a raptor's lunch are a couple bullets and an errant bone. Now, if you're watching this chunky footage and thinking I must be romanticizing the experience of the game, you're right. The truth is, I wouldn't call Kong an especially great game. It's a decent game, sure, especially for a movie tie-in, but if you take away that context and just hold it up to similar games of the era, let alone modern releases, you'll find it isn't all that remarkable. I'm sure many will disagree, and that's fine, but I would ask anyone who claims that this game is genuinely fantastic if you've played it recently. More likely than not, you haven't. Especially considering how hard it is to get your hands on a copy these days, as is the case with so many movie games tied up in copyright hell. If you were to return to it as I did, I wager you'd find it novel and nostalgic, but that's about it. It's an ambitious game with a fun combat system and really engaging art direction, but there's not much here that warrants going too far out of your way to check it out unless you're just really craving a game that puts you toe-to-toe with dinosaurs, which is far too few games indeed. All that said, there's absolutely a reason Kong is remembered as fondly as it is, and I hope to convey exactly what that reason is by talking about the game for a bit, highlighting what I see as the unique strengths of its vision. If you're a fan of the game, I hope it'll be a fun little watch to remind you of one of the more unlikely hits of the late PS2 era. And if not, I hope it provides some insight into why people in comment sections across the internet continually feel the need to mention just how cool this strange little video game is. Had the people behind this game just wanted to make a few bucks, it would have been easy to produce a cheap beat-em-up style game where you play as Kong and get to crack dinosaur heads for a few hours, and that game probably would have made just as much money as this one did. And to be fair, a portion of the game is exactly that, but it isn't really that part of the game that people remember so fondly. It's the much vaster part of the game which sees you playing as Jack Driscoll, writer of stage and screen, as you advance through the savage thicket of Skull Island in search of Anne, and more generally, trying to keep the flesh from being ripped from your body. The game hones in on the Skull Island section of the movie, expanding upon Peter Jackson's depiction of the setting both aesthetically and tonally. In the film, the crew's trek through the island is a strange mix of whimsy and horror to a somewhat diminishing effect. The sorta goofy Brontosaurus stampede sequence being a prime example of this. The whole thing too batshit to be taken as seriously as the movie generally wants to be taken. But here, the visceral quality of the game's first-person perspective shifts the balance to horror in a welcome way that does Skull Island better justice from a thematic standpoint. While it can get kind of lost in the indulgent runtime of the film, Skull Island is dripping with character, its defining quality being its utter primal horror, detailed in exquisite quality in the excellent art book The World of Kong, A Natural History of Skull Island. It's actually a neat little expansion on the film's narrative, acting as a collection of documented discoveries made by expeditions to the island in the wake of the film's events. An early passage describes the island and gives some logic as to how it became such a dangerous and dire place, going, quote, "Tiny Skull Island was once part of the vast and ancient continent of Gondwana in prehistoric times. What came to be Skull Island was a stretch near the coast of the Great Tethys Sea, rich in life. When this landmass broke away, many prehistoric ancestors of the island's modern inhabitants rode with it, guaranteeing their survival when catastrophe and ecological change wiped them out everywhere else in the world. Others joined later, rafting, swimming, or flying to the island sanctuary. Land bridges came and went, bringing new fauna, each adding to the diversity of the island. Over the millennia, the island eroded. As habitat was lost, life was concentrated into ever-shrinking areas. Competition became fierce. The island saw an evolutionary arms race erupt, forging a menagerie of nightmares." End quote. Jackson and the artists at Weta Workshop developed an identity for Skull Island that goes much deeper than a mere tropical dino adventureland, conceptualizing a brutal ecosystem shaped by time and violence. There's a grotesqueness that pervades Skull Island, its creatures too monstrous to fit in anywhere else in the world, remnants of an age when survival meant adapting in cruel and twisted ways. It's a dying world, too, depicted in its collapsing coasts, its ruins of a long-gone civilization, and the implied extinction of Kong's whole species. But it's a world that will go down screaming, biting, and clawing at whatever it can, as that is all it's capable of. At its absolute best, the game feels like an adaptation on this concept, thrusting you into the middle of this clustered chaos and challenging you to fend it off long enough to survive. The movie captures this ferociousness in some of its best scenes, and while the game doesn't have the graphical fidelity to match the film visually, it captures that primal terror through gameplay that is tight and tense. You'll be set against packs of raptors, giant hissing millipedes, screeching pugbats, as well as creatures beyond your capacity to kill outright, the only way to survive them being to outmaneuver them. This isn't to say the game is actually all that difficult, but it nevertheless manifests tension through sleek presentation and a well-curated sense of atmosphere. The environments may not look especially impressive to a modern eye, but they convey the oppressive dread of Skull Island to great effect, as does the music, which complements a range of moods from the ominous melancholy of the main menu to the heart-pounding energy of the action accompaniment. Is it stretching to call the game a horror title? Maybe, but the principal thrill of the gameplay is that of being the prey up against an overwhelming series of predators, which, if you ask me, fits well into the domain of horror. If the game merely had you play as Kong, you may get a sense of the brutality of Skull Island. There's plenty of jaw-snapping and wing-ripping to be done, but Kong's position as the island's apex predator would deprive it of the vital danger that makes it such a grimly alluring locale. As it is, the Kong sections of the game function as short interludes of empowerment sprinkled between the more oppressive first-person portions, and viewing them as such, clunky and bare-bones as they are, they're harmless enough, and give the player the joy of mindlessly bashing away at enemies who, for a short while, are more pest than threat. As Jack, though, we are small, vulnerable, and scrambling to survive against beasts who could easily tear us limb from limb. This is the real game of Kong, Jack's spear-flinging, magazine-counting, bush-burning expedition through the dinosaur nightmare that is Skull Island, and it's there where the game strives towards innovation are most evident and effective. The game's ambitions in its medium are aligned with the film in its own, both respective to what would be considered innovative to those mediums back in 2005. Jackson speaks to how the original King Kong inspired him from an early age in the foreword to the aforementioned art book, The World of Kong, where he writes, quote, "I first saw King Kong when I was 8 years old, and in many ways the world of Skull Island has been a driving force in my creative life ever since. The film was first made in 1933 and featured the awe-inspiring work of stop-motion animator Willis H. O'Brien and the extraordinary art of Marcel Delgado. I watched it from beginning to end, spellbound. King Kong had revealed a world of possibility to me, not just about what film could do, but about the power of imagination itself." End quote. The original Kong represented to Jackson a bold leap forward in what it was possible to portray in the medium of film, using at the time state-of-the-art visual effects to bring the feral world of Skull Island to life. More than anything else, Jackson's 2005 adaptation is a love letter to the original, and lives up to that same promise of pushing visual boundaries, though this time the special effects were much more digital in nature. These days, the heavy use of CGI in blockbuster films is often looked down upon as copping out from supposedly more authentic filmmaking techniques and practical effects. But in 2005, CGI fatigue hadn't really set in, and Jackson's use of it is artful enough that the film still looks great even today, despite how much of it is entirely artificial. The same spirit of innovation lives in the game as well, though if you were judging it purely from a mechanical standpoint, you might not realize it. It's the presentational elements where this ambition to be cutting edge is clear, in the game's efforts to cultivate atmosphere and immersion, to make the world of Skull Island feel alive and dangerous. These days, when we have games that look as good as Red Dead Redemption 2 and have animations as smooth as Death Stranding, it's easy to take for granted a game's ability to craft a sense of casual believability, easy to forget the techniques developers relied upon before graphical fidelity was so polished and animations were so expressive. These techniques are on full display in Kong, a game that mostly adheres to the listen-follow template of pacing that many of the next decade's worth of single-player games would follow, but with the fancy bells and whistles characteristic of bigger budget games stripped away. In modern games discourse, there's a tension between if gameplay should be built around heavily produced sequences defined by impressive technical feats and closely edited moments of tension, or if it should lean into more freeform design, creating dynamic experiences that allow for greater player expression rather than having the player essentially follow a pre-written script. Huge games like Naughty Dog's Uncharted series or the recent remake of Resident Evil 3 are defined by their linearity, which allows them to have wild, precisely blocked set pieces and to tell more straightforward stories using the tried and true language of cinema. Many people love these games for that exact reason, myself included, but it's a perfectly fair critique to claim that this approach to game design ignores a lot about what makes video games unique as an artistic medium, as it doesn't actually allow the player to interact with any given scene beyond the one way the developers specifically intended. Games that stick more to this approach are often described as cinematic, to the point where calling a game cinematic these days has an almost derogatory tinge to it, like it's hiding its mechanical superficiality behind a facade of flair. Back in 2005, though, a game being called cinematic would be considered a huge compliment, as it was much more difficult for the limited technology of the time to create convincing enough scenarios to warrant any comparison to film, and it's this that Kong strives for first and foremost. More so even than Naughty Dog's games, Kong is firmly in the realm of aggressive linearity. There is only ever the one path forward, the one order of encounters, and the one solution to every problem. But it is through this linearity that the game seeks to cultivate immersion, the idea being that the most convincing world is the one where the developers can exercise the tightest control over what the player is experiencing, that allowing more expression will only highlight the inherent artificiality of everything. A modern perspective may feel this has the opposite effect, the game's rigidity only making its artifice more evident, but again, in 2005, pulling such a thing off with even a remote sense of believability was an impressive feat and artfully valuable in itself. The enduring novelty of Kong is in witnessing this effort to make a game that emulates the scale and thrill of an action blockbuster not just with the tools that were available at the time, but with the time's mindset for how those tools could best be used to pull the player into the world. Not all of these efforts necessarily pass the test of time in terms of how effectively they immerse one into the setting, but the intention is clear in most aspects of the game. The NPCs, for example, all of whom are voiced by their respective actors from the film, are pretty chatty, some having little quirks in their scripting like Carl Denham's habit of filming points of interest and particularly impressive monsters, which is clearly meant to make them seem real and reactive. If you've ever played a game that came out after, 2010 or so, they'll probably come off as little more than marionettes, especially considering they leave most of the real work of surviving to you. There's also the fact that most chapters of the game lead directly into one another, granting your trek through the island a sense of continuity. The PS2 version of the game I had growing up even had these ominous cinematics that played between chapters, which showed a map of the island marked with Jack's movement, giving a clear visual of your progression. It's a simple thing, but tremendously effective at making the journey feel vast and continuous, and I was surprised at the extent of my disappointment when the 360 version of the game I acquired recently didn't have these cutscenes, instead having these bland loading screens that killed immersion by pointing out that the level I was entering was titled something dumb like To the Lair, or Kong's Lair, or Fight in the Lair, and giving me no sense of just how far I'd come. Maybe the most notable decision made for the sake of immersion is the complete lack of any HUD, meaning there are no health bars or ammo counters between you and whatever's trying to eat you in any given moment. This is a huge part of the game's visual identity, and as such I think it's ultimately a good thing, but some of the workarounds used to convey necessary information in its place don't come across the smoothest. Health is communicated by a standard red filter distortion effect like you'd see in the average Call of Duty, though I found the effect to be intense enough that it actually made responding to the threat at hand difficult, especially since it's accompanied by a somber musical sting that all but drowns out all the surrounding sound. Atmospheric? Yes. Conducive to smooth gameplay? Not so much. What's less obstructive and more hilarious is how the game communicates your ammunition count, which is by having Jack just say it out loud to himself at the push of a button. It works, sure, and is telling of what would be considered a pro-immersion move back in the day, since most games these days would probably consider a HUD less intrusive on player immersion than having Adrian Brody go, "Oh no!" to communicate that you're out of ammo, though I find it charmingly goofy regardless. Keeping yourself stocked and defended against the enemy involves keeping a close eye on the environment. You restock on guns and ammo through crates that are being conveniently airdropped all over the island, and you can only carry one gun at a time, meaning there's occasionally some tactical thinking needed to decide whether what's left of the gun you have should be exchanged for whatever else is available. Weapon variety is limited but easily digestible. A pistol for small enemies, a shotgun for larger ones, a rifle for keeping things at a distance, and a Tommy gun that's powerful but balanced by its rarity. You'll never be able to carry enough bullets to last more than a few encounters, meaning you're encouraged to be conservative with ammo and use the throwable weapons positioned around the island whenever possible, which is good because the throwable weapons are the most fun. These include spears and bones, spears being the more powerful but limited variant, while bones can be picked endlessly from piles. While a gun will always be more reliable, what makes the throwable weapon such a blast is their limitations. You can only carry one at a time, so throwing it away means having to scramble to get another in your hand before whatever you just pissed off takes a bite out of you. Spears and bones will protrude from enemies you hit with them. Smaller enemies like the millipedes can even be pinned to walls by a good throw, so often your best option is to pull the same spear you just threw into an enemy out of them and thrust it right back in. It's savagely satisfying, but you can only use the same spear or bone a couple times before they'll splinter and be practically useless. The more intense battles of the game see you with basically no guns at all, frantically managing where all the spears and bone piles in an area are and hoping your aim is true, which is easier said than done, since without any HUD markers indicating where your spear will land, it takes a fair amount of practice to get good with the spears, and even then you're liable to whiff a throw at the worst possible moment. This gives combat a dynamic feel, even within the fairly tight constraints of any given scenario. I'll admit it's hard not to feel the limits of the game's interactivity revisiting it, especially considering that it has some mechanics that would fit right into a more open approach. Take the whole every species on this island eats each other motif, which allows you to distract some creatures by either killing something else in the vicinity or by spearing some grub and tossing it nearby. This is primarily used to move environmental hazard type enemies like swarms of spiders who will block your path, or to cluster enemies into burnable patches of grass so that they might be conveniently defeated with minimal expenditure of resources. But it's easy to imagine how such mechanics could be expanded upon to make traversal through an area more flexible, allow the player more expression in how they handle any given problem. The game's use of such mechanics never really amounts to more than the most basic application, and I can only think of 1 or 2 points in the game where actual stealth or diversion of enemies is actually taken as acceptable, meaning you end up having to fight and slay most of the monsters in your path even when the tools to subvert them are at hand. These mechanics add some flavor to proceedings beyond straight up brawling with everything that moves, without ever allowing much meaningful distinction from those basic rhythms. This is ultimately what keeps the game from being as great as it sounds on paper, as however interesting the systems are, they're never given the opportunity to flourish into something greater than the sum of their parts, instead getting stuck into fairly repetitive patterns of enemy encounters that start to blend together and lose their tension as the game moves on. There are some standout sections, like the Brontosaurus Stampede, which has been tamed from the film, requiring you to traverse a long valley while avoiding getting squashed by the Brontos and/or eaten by ambushing raptors until you can find a fire source, which you then have to carry all the way back, lighting altars and burning patches of grass to give yourself little checkpoints of fire should you lose what you're carrying. It's a fun scenario that utilizes the game's systems in a creative way, but it's one of few instances where the mold that defines much of the game's chapters is broken. Though the game loses something in keeping the player on such a tight leash, this approach does lead to some of the game's most memorable sequences. If any sections of the game can be labeled as set pieces, it's the sections which pit you against the colossal V-Rex. And yes, it is V-Rex, not T-Rex. Let's not act like we're too cool to say it right. The V-Rex rolls up at multiple points in the game, each time usually involving you needing to run from it for a bit before stopping to dance with it while the NPCs take their sweet time clearing the path forward. Handling it is fairly simple. If it gets too close, you die. If you can do even a small amount of damage to it, it takes a moment to share its feelings, which is the moment it won't be lumbering menacingly towards you. So you simply have to stay out of its reach and apply damage or distractions with smaller beasts when appropriate until whatever you're waiting for to open gets opened. Mechanically speaking, it's all very rudimentary, but it's made novel by the scale of the thing, by the boom of its footfalls and how your vision blurs from the intensity of its roars, by how you're not done for until its gaping maw fills your entire screen. Their movement is deceptive as well, as for a second or so they'll only move at a crawl, then they start ramping up, and as soon as you realize they're actually moving pretty fast, gulp, you're gone. Dealing with them may be easy after a time or two, but finding yourself in an arena with one is never anything short of alarming for how quickly things can go bad if you take your eye off the ball for even 1 second. These sections hold up not because they're all that impressive on a technical level, but because there's a lot of charm in experiencing an old vision of what exciting cinematic gameplay looked like. It's a lot like the original 1933 Kong in that way, since nobody today is going to watch that film and be spellbound by its effects the way a young Jackson was. But if taken in context, in understanding how a contemporary audience would have been agog at the stop-motion monkey wrestling with the sock puppet-looking dinosaurs, one can still easily appreciate the strides it took towards achieving what we now see as mundane. Functionally, the V-Rex may be little more than a loud, cheesable object for the player to avoid, but the game knew how to dress that object up in just such a way so as to make it an engaging, unforgettable sequence. And assuming you've got the imagination to place yourself in the position of someone popping this disc into their console way back in 2005, it's easy to see why this game is considered ahead of its time in as many ways as it can also be considered harshly dated. People have wanted to see this game return in some capacity for a long time, including petitions to have the thing remastered, but that's obviously not going to happen, what with how the Kong franchise has changed creative hands once or twice since 2005. Really though, there's nothing stopping a whole new franchise from picking up where this game left off and going all the way with it. Kong himself may not have the time to get involved, he's got a fresh helping of MonsterVerse gigs on his plate these days, but he honestly isn't a necessary part of the formula at all. Just give me a spear and throw me into a larger, more open environment with greater enemy variety and a plethora of chaotic, compounding systems to create that precarious atmosphere, and you've got one hell of a recipe for a dinosaur-themed survival horror title. Alternatively, I'd love to see the game adapted for VR. Imagine confronting the V-Rex to scale, having to actually wind back and thrust the spear in order to throw it, to have to actually pick bones from piles rather than mashing the button and hoping Jack gets a grip on something. I know it's all just dreaming, but hey, dreaming is free, and I choose to dream of the awesome game that Kong could evolve to be if it were placed in the right hands. In all likelihood, though, Peter Jackson's King Kong, the official game of the movie, will remain exactly where it is, now and forevermore, and maybe that's just fine. After all, the ideal of the game likely exists more in the heads of those who enjoyed it years ago than it ever really did in practice, and there are far worse legacies to leave than that. Hello. If you're hearing this, it means you got to the end of the video. Allow me to say thank you very much. I appreciate you taking the time, and I hope you found it interesting. It was a lot of fun to make. If you did enjoy it, you may also enjoy another video I did on BioShock Infinite, which I put up last month, so feel free to check that out. Or don't, it doesn't matter. Anyway, thanks for watching, and see ya.
Jimmy, you alright?
Achoo!